Hey there, Matt. How are you? All right, let's get all set up here.
I ran the competition there for about 11 years. And during that time, I saw a lot of growth from writers, saw them move up the ranks from lower level writer to upper level, working with a few of them right now at Lit. And so just, it's fun to be on this side of things now, to be a competition judge for other competitions, and including the Austin Film Festival, of course. Being somebody that competition directors also hit up to for their writers. So I can definitely speak to both sides of the coin here.
Beautiful. Amazing. Thank you. Daniela, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Tough act to follow. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniela. I work at Circle Confusion. I've been a literary manager at the company for 5 years now. And I started my career at Circle, homegrown. And something that I always have enjoyed as being a representative is being invited to judge competitions. It is such an exciting place to discover new voices and also get to read more work from some of the kind of competition veterans who love to submit every year. So it's exciting to kind of be on this panel and talk with Matt with his experience and under Jorge's kind of like as a moderator, talk through some of these questions just to help you guys feel encouraged. And it's an amazing community that is born out of these competitions. And I just love it as kind of an aspect of the writing community.
Amazing. Thank you. So to kick things off, I'm really curious to get your insight. Daniela, you were sort of touching on this a little bit, but and feel free, by the way, as we ask these questions, either of you can jump in here and piggyback off each other as you see fit. But in your opinion, why do writing competitions, why do they matter?
Well, I guess I'll kick things off there. It's a great avenue for writers are trying to establish themselves, new voices to be heard. It's incredibly tough just in general, but it's one of the avenues for writers to get their work out there, because to get your work in front of producers, execs, even managers and agents can be a bit tough. Often we're looking for a guarantee, we're looking for referrals. We need some kind of thing to really show that you've been vetted, somebody who can vouch for you. Competitions are a great way to do that. But over the years, there are so many more competitions now. The number of submissions go up almost every year for a lot of the prominent competitions. So the competition literally gets more fierce. So I think if you can make your way up to the top of that pile of 10,000, 12,000 submissions and you win the whole thing, or a finalist or in the top group, that means something. That means that this is somebody who we should check out. It matters definitely for us as reps, because I know, Daniela, you judge for competitions, we judge for competitions as well. That's how we find new talent. It's not just the one way, but it's one way where we're all participating as judges, we're all participating in panels, hopefully going to festivals and screenwriting conferences again soon to meet writers. And so that's one avenue, really, and why it still matters, and there's many different platforms too. To make a plug for Roadmap, like, you guys do such a great job with your platform. You're always in touch with us. Joey Tuccio especially hits me up literally every week. And so I think that's why something like this really matters, especially since we've gone into this virtual format in the past year. So many more opportunities have opened up for a lot of writers across the board. So that's sort of the long-winded answer for why competitions matter.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that, just because, well, it is a competition and there are rankings. Something that I personally still love to look at are the quarterfinalists and the semifinalists, because it is subjective in terms of there are judges and everyone has different taste, and sometimes I feel like specifically with the Nichols contest, like I'm like, there are quarterfinalists that I'll read that I'll enjoy more than the top 10 finalists. And it really just comes from a place of like looking at the scope and seeing through that there has been a filtering process about, you know, just the quality of the work. So I think Matt really just like crystallized a lot of the points that I was going to make, but something that I just wanted to affirm is that, you know, at least for myself, I don't go, I'm only reading the top one. And as a judge, I get to read the variety. And they're just different elements that I'm considering in terms of how to evaluate each script against each other and also as them as they stand alone. But one aspect, and I think just thinking about roadmap as a part of the community is just that it is an amazing opportunity to network with other writers and reading other people's work and just seeing what's out there. Sometimes contests will have like 5 scripts around the same subject. I'm like, I didn't realize that was in the zeitgeist, or like writers had this story kind of pouring out of them, but seeing the difference in the execution, I feel like why that matters to me as a representative is it really helps me get plugged back into what is out there kind of outside of the world of kind of Hollywood, and the competition space really is like the every person space. And it just is amazing to see that variety. So I can continue to burst at the seams, but I know.
Oh no, I love that you said that.
For us.
I love that you said that because I wish I could. When I was at AFF, I wish I could do this experiment where I took literally every single script that was submitted for that year and then just do it all over again and see what the results are. It's gonna be different. There's something called subjectivity, you know. And to your point about zeitgeist, like I saw that all the time. Like I don't know how many times this particular subject would come up, you know, from like readers would tell me that too. So it's just fun to get a sense of like what stories people are excited about, like you said, outside of Hollywood, because we're kind of in our own bubble about stuff, you know, and this is just open globally for people to submit. So it's fascinating to see what people are working on.
No, I love that. You touched on a few things that I'd like to speak to. One is the zeitgeist sort of component of it. And I really love, Daniela, how you mentioned that, you know, even if you read a bunch of stories that take place in sort of like the same time period or same setting, that unique voice and that unique sort of perspective into that story can help something sort of rise to the top and stand out maybe from something else that was in that same sort of time period. And so that leads me to my next question, which is, you know, what aspects or elements of a script really stand out to you when you're judging a competition?
I mean, it's a tough question because there are like so many different aspects and every writer has their different strengths. But something that really stands out to me is the writer's command of the genre. So if I'm reading a horror script and I am terrified, it is so cool to have that experience, because most often it's like when you go into a movie theater, you turn on Netflix or whatever, you have that experience in a space. But when I can get that equivalent reading a script, it just showcases to me that that writer has like really understands the space that they're writing in. And so if it's a comedy and I'm laughing out loud, like that really stands out. And it's a shame to say that that does not often happen. If I'm reading a thriller and I'm not thrilled, it can still be well written, but it kind of gives me a little bit of pause because it gives me a sense that the writer may not be as well versed or hasn't like honed in their craft. So there's that aspect. And then I think another thing is the unpredictability of a piece of material, of like turning the page and being just completely consumed by a story and being really taken along a journey in a way that it's like, I think Matt and I can agree the amount of scripts that we read, there are certain things that feel like second nature where all of a sudden you're like, oh, someone might die or this is going to happen. And so when I'm reading a script and I'm just pleasantly surprised, that is really exciting. It really just changes and breaks up some of the monotony that can come with reading a lot of material.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that. Because we read so much, often scripts will blur together because they're similar subject matter, similar writing styles. And so we just want to be surprised. Like we like to think that we've seen it all, but we do this because we want to find these new stories, new perspectives. Can you play with those expectations? Can you surprise us? And can you play with those expectations? We go into a typical rom-com and then you subvert the tropes of that genre. Can you do that and with flying colors? I also love when, because it's, with film and TV, that's such a visual medium, that we're reading, this is a literary thing still in script form. I love when a writer can give like little winks just for the reader. It may not translate visually, and as long as it's not gimmicky or cutesy, but they give it just for us, that it feels like we are in the hands of a storyteller, a writer, but also somebody who has a good grasp of the visual medium as well. But yeah, I echo a lot of what Daniela just said too.
Thank you. And actually, Matt, I want to go back to something that you mentioned a little bit before. You were talking about, quarterfinalists, semifinalists. And funny enough, I remember you were either, I believe you actually might have moderated a panel. This was a few years ago in LA, and it was one of your like day in LA Austin Film Festival events. And there was a writer there, I think it was like Wes Ball.
Wes Brown.
Wes Brown. And he was sharing something about, he had entered the Nickel one year and didn't hear anything back. And then he entered it again the following year. He was like, hey, congrats, you're a semifinalist. The year after that, got a personal note, hey, you're top 30. And then, fourth or fifth year, he won. And so I'm curious, in your opinion, do you feel that writers should, what's the right balance of submitting the same script to a competition year after year versus trying a different piece of material? I'd love to get your input on that.
For sure. Actually, I think that writer was Michael Werwey, who is the writer of Extremely Wicked and Incredibly Wild. And I think that was the script that he had kept trying with.
Got it.
But it's a testament to just how this business works. It's persistence. And all it takes is for one person to raise their hand. And sometimes it's not the right timing. In the world of competitions and fellowship programs, it's in the hands of a couple of readers, hopefully at least 2 to 3 readers. Even then, that you need a variety of opinions, but that's still a small sampling. And and as Daniela knows, when we take out material for our clients, we can go wide with like 20, 30, 40, 50 places, and they all say no. But then a year later, they're like, oh, that one script was an afterthought. Somebody will raise their hand. Like, okay, how come we didn't hit up that person first? So it is about persistence. And I think one of the misconceptions about resubmitting to competitions, at least for the Austin Film Festival, and I think I could probably safely speak for the Nickel as well, because I know them as well too, is that it's not like you get some sort of like demerit point, like, oh, well, they got declined one year. We're not going to consider them any further. You get fresh eyes. I know at the Austin Film Festival we always made sure that there were always the same reader was not getting the same script. And I think a lot of competitions do the same thing. So it's about persistence and absorbing feedback that you get. A lot of competitions provide feedback. So it's knowing what to implement in your work. Speaking of the Nickel, there was another writer who I think, God, who was it? She was a finalist one year, I believe, and didn't win, got notes from one of the judges, gave her a whole bunch of notes. And this is I forgot who it was, top level producer guy, and did not listen to any of those notes, submitted exactly the same script, and then won the whole thing.
Wow.
So it's like, who knows anything, really, So again, it's a crapshoot, luck of the draw, but if you believe in it, the key thing here is just persistence.
No, I think that's a really cool story. Thank you for sharing that, and also for clarifying the name of that writer who was on that panel. I'm curious, when a competition reaches out to you, and you're both judging the JumpStart competition this year, yay. But I'm curious, when you say yes, I'm going to do it, are you primarily thinking about it like, okay, are you reading for potential representation consideration in mind? Like, is that always sort of at the back of your mind as you are doing that, using it as a way to discover talent?
Was that
I
for
mean,
me?
I think for both of us.
Yeah, yeah.
For myself speaking, like when I'm judging, it's always at the forefront of my mind of like, you know, is this someone that I would want to represent? Now, that's not how I'm like judging the material, because sometimes there's a really great script that I might not necessarily represent. That can be sometimes a misconception, right? Like every script that we love, we want to represent, but I'm also very cognizant about my sensibilities and the kind of scripts that I want to be advocating for. And so if I read like a sexy thriller where there's a really high body count, I'm like, I know I would really enjoy watching this movie, but I don't know if I would want to represent it. Just kind of not getting too in the weeds with that, but that was just an example. But I'm always looking at it as like, what is this person's voice? Do I want to meet this writer? And kind of like the curiosity that can often stem from reading a piece of work. And so as I'm judging a contest and I'm reviewing the work, those things are in my mind because that's just an instinct as a representative who's been doing it as long as I have. And if those questions don't arise, I don't knock the script, but I just think that it's something that for everyone who's listening, that they should keep in mind that the judges, like our jobs first and foremost, whether we're producers or managers, we have an instinct ingrained in us when we're looking at a piece of material. And then we're judges next. So, you know, I can't turn that part of my brain off.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like we're wearing both hats, like looking for representation, looking for potential producing projects. You know, we're very picky about what we choose to produce, especially if it's something that was already written and we haven't even repped the writer. But we're always looking for voice in terms of representation. I think that's why competitions are great, because again, these are new voices really trying to be heard, and we're in a great time right now where there's the most authentic storytellers are being championed. And we're as participating in these different competitions and diversity programs, fellowships and labs and all that, you know, we're being exposed to so many different types of voices. And so we're always looking for voice. And like what Daniela said, I may love to watch this movie if it gets made, but may not necessarily want us to be a part of it in say like in a producing capacity, or that maybe the script needs a lot of work, but the voice is absolutely there. And it may not be something that can be produced, because sometimes there are those just things that should just stay as specs, as samples, you know. So we're looking at these in many different ways.
Great.
Wait, can I say something? Because someone, I know they didn't put it in the Q&A box, but it got my attention, which is kind of the distinction between voice versus story. Jorge, did you see that pop up? No, Jacob, don't apologize. You're disrupting the format. It's okay. It caught my attention, and I thought it was a very interesting kind of distinction. You know, for me, I think they go hand in hand, right? Like if you're telling a story about, let's say, Jim Henson, the voice that you're bringing into that story in particular, the writer, that's the command. That's, you know, anyone can write a story about Jim Henson, but that perspective, that voice reflecting that story, I think that as a judge, I'm looking at what is the voice that's infusing that story, because I don't want to feel like I'm reading a Wikipedia page about Jim Henson if we're talking about a biopic. But even a story that requires a lot of invention, it is inherent that a voice is part of that, because I can't figure out a way to separate the two.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. No. Jacob, I love it. Thank you. That was good. And Daniela, good eyes for catching that. Matt, you were talking a little bit about the difference between a script or a client that you would potentially consider for representation as opposed to producing. Both of your companies are both management and production companies. I'm just curious, like when you're reading material, what are some of those sort of flags that are waved that, you know, make the bells go off in your brain that say, hey, this would be a great producing vehicle, this would be a great client, or maybe the best of both worlds, like maybe we'll do both. I'm curious, like what are some of the things that distinguish, in your opinion, one versus the other?
Oh, for sure. Well, I think for producing, it's always a case by case thing. Like if we know that there's a particular need for something, a particular buyer, producer who's looking for something in this arena and it happens to line up, and or it actually is something that fits the need for across the board with many different companies and producers and buyers, then that's something that definitely goes off in our heads. So it's hard to say because it's case by case.
Right.
You can kind of look at our slate and assume that you might know what our brand is, but we're genre agnostic. We follow our passions, and but it's a group discussion that we have internally. But in terms of representation, and like I think it's kind of what I was saying already earlier about what we look for in clients and material and voice. I'm not sure what specifics you want more on the representation side of stuff.
No, I think I appreciate you sharing that. It was more so on the producing side, like what really sort of stands out, because you did speak earlier to the elements about what stands out as a great client, potential client. So I was curious about the producing side of things.
Oh, sure.
So thank you, Daniela. I'm curious, any sort of perspective there in terms of what sort of jumps out as a great producing vehicle?
Well, so I can't speak for Circle in so much as we have a separate production department. So as a judge, sometimes I'll read something that I might flag for them, and then there's a conversation. But since I strictly manage, in terms of what they're considering, I think Matt spoke to just in general, any producers looking at who are the buyers out there, what's the appetite, and then sometimes people are going to take a flyer on a piece of material that might not have a buyer, but they're just super excited about the idea, or they're super excited about kind of the perspective on it. And so in many ways, it is my responsibility as a judge and as a representative of my company to communicate internally, if there's a potential piece of material, but I leave it to them in terms of what they decide to take on and kind of what that path looks like.
Wonderful. Okay. I'm curious when it comes to, so let's say, you've read a great piece of material, you're super jazzed about it, and you reach out to the writer and you have a conversation. When you're talking to a writer for potential representation, I'm curious, what is one of the most important questions that you feel a writer should ask a potential rep that is circling them?
I'll sort of tweak my response in that we ask a lot of questions. So I hope that they answer, or at least ask a question that we may not have asked. But there is such a thing as asking too many questions. Like when a writer pulls out a sheet of paper and they have 20 questions, I would like to know how you handle commission and this, and oh boy, this person could be a handful. There is such a thing as being over prepared. I think for us, we like to approach these generals as nothing, very informal, very casual, conversational, a back and forth thing, because we want to get a sense of what this working relationship is going to be like. I want a client who can potentially be a friend, somebody who I can have a meal with and have drinks with and be okay with talking to them late at night if need be, And so in terms of the questions, I normally just like to ask again, how would you define your voice? What is your superpower as a storyteller? What do you bring to the table? What is your life experience? We're not just promoting the story, we're promoting the storyteller as well. So it's not just about the questions, but are they promoting themselves enough? Do they understand who they are? Do they understand what their brand is? Do they understand how they fit and how their material fits into the marketplace? And so I think if there's anything about questions is I would feel if I forgot to ask what that working, what is it like to work with you? What are your expectations? I think that's probably the top question they should always ask if we don't ask that, but that's always something that I make sure I do ask. But yeah, I think that just kind of covers it sort of in broad strokes.
Excellent.
I'll never forget the time there was a potential client that literally sent me a questionnaire after our like 1 hour conversation. And it was like essentially like wargaming every random scenario. And I think that as you brought that up, I got a little sense of PTSD because there was a moment in which I considered filling it out. And then I was like, oh no, like what Matt is getting at is like, this is a potential client relationship is so much about like, are you guys compatible as people? And then talking about as a career strategist, can we develop a shorthand? And so if there might be a manager out there who will take that survey and like thrive off of that type of energy. But like for me personally, I think I'm in line with Matt, where it's like, I really want someone where we can really develop that shorthand, someone I want to be spending time with, because the commitment ideally is for the duration of their career. And so no one wants to feel reluctant to take someone's call or feel like they're being tested. It's just so much of like, as you go through circumstances, you've developed a trust where, you know, I can trust how the client's going to respond, as well as the client's going to trust how I'm going to navigate a difficult situation with them. But I guess, you know, I think that it's very much of like, if you're fortunate enough after having submitted your script and a representative wants to meet you, to ask yourself the question of what is their value to your career? And what is their value that they're stepping in? Because if they don't feel like they're going to be helping you, or you don't feel like you need that, you don't need to force a relationship.
I think another question also is to ask just, it's about process. And again, like what your expectations are. Do you develop? Because funny enough, it's the job of the manager to develop, but there are a lot of managers who just don't, you know? And so to understand what the expectations are, what is that weekly progress with me as your potential rep? Because writers need to know that. Like, you don't want to get into a sticky situation where you decide to just sign with the first manager that you meet with, because maybe that's the only meeting that you were able to get. And then now you're stuck in a situation where you're not even hearing from this rep. You've worked on a draft of the script, and you're waiting to get notes like 2-3 months later. Like, you need to know what that weekly progress is, what the expectations are going into it, because ultimately what writers need are a creative partner, somebody who will be on the ground with them, because that's the job of a manager. So I think questions related to that are important.
No, thanks for sharing that. I love that you also brought up, like, you know, not all managers and their skill sets are created equal, right? Some have more of a development background, and that's, you know, some love to really roll up their sleeves and dive in. So they're, you know, different strokes for different folks. I'm curious, when it comes to competition placements, you know, what do you feel are some do's and don'ts for writers in terms of how they can promote their contest placements? What are some great ways that, or examples that you've seen where a writer can be proactive and you know, kind of leverage their placement to another opportunity?
I guess I'll go. Well, like Daniela said, like I'm intrigued also by like a second rounder placement, a quarterfinalist placement, but I think if that's the only thing that you're going to lead off with in a query, it may not be enough. I would say it's not really enough. Like, you would need more on top of that. Maybe an interesting backstory. Like, if, hey, I just found out I'm a second round or a quarterfinalist in this program. Great. Maybe if it's still, you know, waiting for results, sure, maybe just to get in on it early before they announce winners. Like, yeah, maybe, you know, but, you know, like we were talking about earlier, it's not always just about the winners or the finalists, right? You know, so if there's anything else that you could add on top of that, like the lower placement that you have, the more you need on top of that. There is also such a thing as over promoting the number of accolades, laurels that you've gotten for your project, your script, or even say like a film. If you've only received accolades from competitions for like the last 10 years and you have nothing else to show for it. Now, I know this is really a tough business to crack into, but if there is such a thing as just somebody who's always just in the competition scene, but never really to break through. It's not really a red flag, but it is a question that at least goes on in my mind of why don't you have a rep? Why haven't you ever had a rep? Or maybe you just never thought of one, but like, I just have a lot of questions. Like, you've done so well, how come no one has discovered you yet? You know, and so again, it's a tough business, but that's the question that I also have in my mind. But if we're talking queries, how to promote yourself out there, I think I could probably, and Danielle too can probably talk forever about queries, the do's and don'ts of those.
Yeah, I feel like that's its own its own webinar one day, right?
We could literally spend an hour talking about it. Although, like, queries tends to be the ways in which I see that contest promotion, as well as social media. But I do think that there's a delicate balance. And also think about timing, because all the quarterfinalists are notified at the same time, all the semifinalists and all the finalists. And I think as clockwork, almost the day after, the day of, I'll get a query, multiple queries from people who've placed. And you just have to kind of be mindful. You know, when I attend AFF, I think that Monday, 2 or 3 years ago, I had over like 45 people who wanted me to read their script. It took me a year to get through them. But if someone catches me like at a different time or like a different season when it's a little bit slow, or I've just finally gotten through, I think that, you know, it's still viable. And, you know, I just think it's just being mindful. Like, if just to think about the equivalent experience, if you were in the room with someone and they're aware that you've placed in a contest, or, you know, all this stuff, if you just kept bothering them and be like, hey, I'm a quarterfinalist. Hey, I'm a quarterfinalist. Hey, I think to Matt's point, it's like finding additional ways to integrate that into your story. But making it the only part of your story makes it very difficult, as when we're promoting a piece of work, we're also promoting the storyteller. And so we want to be able to kind of look at the whole package as well.
I'll also add to it too, that use the competition administrators as well, because it's their job to promote you. Think of them in a way as an interim rep for you. And it took me a while to realize that, hey, I think I'm kind of repping these writers for, you know, a while. When I was at AFF, like, they kept coming to me asking for notes and who could I introduce them to. And then I realized, hey, this is how I can generate success stories for my organization. And also, of course, promoting and helping championing these writers. So, you know, not to say like people hit up Jorge and Joey and like, hey, can you introduce me to Matt and Daniela? You know, I'm sure that happens a lot for you, Daniela. You know, if it makes sense, then ask for that favor, especially if you place high. If you're a winner, you absolutely should be asking that. Like, what are you doing for me? If you're a finalist, especially, semifinalist maybe, but use them.
Yeah, no, and to that point is, I think that a competition that is, you know, worth its weight is proactively doing that to begin with, as opposed to just sort of sitting on their hands. You know, and of course there are a lot of writers that they are interacting with, but that still they should find the ones that they can, you know, help champion, because that's what I mean. Matt, I'm sure you know this and experience this, but like, when you read something that you're just fired up about, like, you can't stop thinking about it. All you want to do is figure out who can I, you know, which rep can I reach out to, you know, and all of that. So so yeah, I totally hear what you're saying. That's really great. That's really great perspective there. Matt, you mentioned this briefly, and I want to open this up to both of you in terms of, because we were talking a little bit about like, what is the right balance of, you know, of course you don't want to say in your bio, hey, I placed in these like 35 competitions. That's going to take up way too much real estate on your bio. But like, when it comes to branding, what are your thoughts on there? You know, I know some reps have the mindset like branding is important. It allows them to sort of know how they can present you to the town, and others are like, hey, you know, branding isn't so important to me. I'm curious, you know, does that matter? Or do you, you know, prefer writers that work in every single genre?
You know, I think the way to sort of adjust how we think of branding is like, why you to tell this story? Then that kind of dispels everything in terms of genres. But I think say you sell a script and it makes out in the trades, it's a big action comedy adventure thing, whatever. People are going to know you for that. That may be just like sort of a one-off thing that you decided to do and forgot about, and then that was the thing that sold. But maybe not be quite your brand. But as storytellers, as human beings, you put a little bit of yourself in there. I think you should be able to know who you are and what you bring to the table. So if you want to talk about it sort of in that sense, but again, it's like, why you? Did you live this in some kind of way? Is this based on your life, your experience, somebody that you know personally? Thematically, maybe it's something that ties into your life in some way, how you view the world. But if you get down just to the nitty gritty of just branding, like say you're known for selling comedy scripts, but you want to do, your dark sort of indie sci-fi thing, whatever. That might be a tough sell to the people that know and love you. And you're going to have to sort of prove yourself all over again. But again, it's like, why you to tell this story, and why you in this genre? Like, a true storyteller is going to be in literally everything that they've written.
Yeah, I always think about the convictions of writers, and that's a question that I ask every potential client, right? Like, you have this amazing tool and skill set, but like, what are you writing? Who are you writing for? What are you writing towards? And sometimes writers don't know the answer, and that's fine. I don't hold it against them. But I think it's so much about what Matt's saying is like, it's not to put that person in a box. I think that becomes a theme that can be an undercurrent, the connective tissue. But something that I keep in mind if I'm reading a competition script and it's a comedy and I meet with the writer and they're like, I actually really love horror, I'm gonna ask to read a horror. Because, it's like I've been invited into a conversation that lives in a specific genre, and then I'm now being asked to look at something else. And so I'm not going to just go, well, you can write this, so I'm going to assume you can write it all. There are some writers that are very good at writing a genre, and then when they try something else, it kind of takes a little bit of more work and adjustment to see that through. But something that kind of advice that I give writers is just that if you have a wide spectrum of genres that you enjoy writing, that being able to talk through like, how are you pivoting or creating like a piece of content that bridges that? So if you love action and you love comedy, do you have an action comedy and something that can kind of show that spectrum of work? And it's also just because Hollywood's going to categorize you, right? Like, they're just going to be like, to Matt's point, it's like, you sold a comedy and then now you want to write a horror. It can be a little bit difficult, especially because some of the producers don't work in both of those spaces. So you have to be reintroduced. I think a lot of the writers who've been able to write across multiple genres have been able to establish relationships with people that just trust them as writers, that then within that trust, they go, send me anything. And that takes a lot of time to develop. And so I think with the right representative or the right piece of material, you can get through that major obstacle. But it's something that we are keeping in mind, at least for anyone developmental, is a version of branding, right? And like, who is this writer? Because otherwise it can feel a little bit like a Sisyphean effort.
Got it. Thank you. Matt, this question is specific for you. I've heard a few writers debate this, and there's some differing thoughts on this. I'm curious your take. When a writer enters a competition, let's say they're on the competition circuit, do you think that they should still be working on that same script, like kind of actively rewriting it while let's say it's out in 5 different competitions, like for a specific season and time? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, there is such a thing as, developing forever, like you don't really want to get stuck doing that. At some point, you're going to have to be able just to let it go and be like, I'm done with this for now, I mean, until it makes it on screen, hopefully, it's never truly done, but you also don't want to be working on it literally every day for the next 10 years. But I think, yeah, like I mentioned before, when you enter a competition, you may get some feedback. And so if you get that feedback and you're planning on entering another one, then, and if it makes sense to implement it, like you don't want to just take every single note, but I think if you start getting the same notes over and over again, then there's something there maybe, but at some point you're going to have to let that go because you have to work on other things. To be relevant in this industry is to constantly generate. You need multiple pieces of material a year because you never know what's going to sell, kind of like what we talked about earlier, that it's really about generating. And so you don't want to keep tinkering around with that one thing that's already out there in competitions. If you all of a sudden, get all of your placement notifications and you got rejected for all of them, then that might be telling you something that this is not it. But if you start to see that you're improving when you enter in each competition, implementing notes and then resubmitting somewhere else, and you start to see that improvement, not always is the case, then maybe it is worth constantly working on it. But the real key point here is like, that can't be the only thing. You need more.
Right. No, I've said this before, and like, this is like, I think it's really important for writers to remember, like, to always be, what's it, Glenn Ross, ABC. I think it's, always be creating is what the creative community should be thinking about. Because, for some executives, if you're meeting them as a writer, you might be one of 5 meetings for that day, which means you're one of 25 meetings they've had that week, which means, you can keep doing the math. And so staying relevant and having new content to continue to be on their radar and have things to talk about is incredibly valuable, because otherwise, if you wrote that one great script, but that was like 5 years ago, then, you've kind of maybe fallen by the wayside. So yeah, I mean, the need to always be creating, I totally agree with that, because that's how you continue to stay fresh, stay relevant, and have new ways to strike up conversations and create meaningful inroads. So I love that. Thank you. I have one more question before we'll switch over to some Q&A. I want to get your thoughts on this. I'm not saying I agree with it or disagree with it, but what are your thoughts on the idea that new emerging writers should work with new and up and coming managers, as opposed to a new emerging writer working with someone who is has been in the business for 1,000 years? Do you have any, either of you have any opinions on that?
That's a really tough question, only because every manager is different and every representative is different in terms of their experience, what they're bringing to the table. Mm-hmm. And every writer, regardless of where they are in their career, is going to want something specific. So I know that was a very vague answer, but something that I think about is there'll be a writer who's up and coming and is like, I don't want to work with a coordinator that's about to get about to get promoted. I would rather work with the partner or a principal of that company, because I feel like that reflects my status as a writer. And then I'll have a conversation with a writer who's being somewhat picky about the type of representation that they want or the level of experience. And I'll say, like, how communicative do you want to be with your representative? How involved do you want them to be? And they're like, well, I want them to read every draft. I want them to be able to take my call. I'm like, I'm sorry to say, but not every partner of a company that's like running a company, handling all these different aspects of running a company, which also includes their clients, is going to take on that responsibility without bringing on someone who's up and coming. But there are people at my company who've been working for 20 years who love discovery, who love working with up and comers, and are making themselves available to answer all questions, during all appropriate times of the day. But it really just depends on what you're looking for, because someone more experienced like a veteran representative is going to have different contacts and different relationships, but maybe those people aren't going to be like, hey, I really want to read this, semi-finalist. I want a script that has a director on an A-list actor, so there's definitely a balance. But I would say, like, it really just depends, because it's such a personalized service that a representative is providing their client, that I wouldn't say like it's equal, like, if you just breaking in, then you should only be working with someone who's also breaking in their career.
I agree with all of that 110%. I would have said exactly all the same stuff. It is like a relationship. It is a relationship. It's a marriage, essentially, without the ring. One Well, maybe sometimes there's a ring involved.
You never know.
You never know. But yeah, it's like I think it goes back to your earlier question about asking the right questions. Like, how do I fit into your daily, weekly, day? Like, how often would we be communicating? What are the expectations that you have for me, and here are the expectations that I have? And if you don't feel like you can service me, would there be somebody else on the team to handle more of the day-to-day stuff? So often we'll partner up. Multiple managers over here at Lit will get together and we'll rep one client, and one will be more hands-on, but we're all pretty hands-on. So again, it comes down to the passion for the writer and for the material. And again, it's a relationship that will always evolve. Sometimes a rep will be super attentive because there's something super actionable, but then there may be something that's like your passion project that may not quite align with what we think is actually actionable. And so, it's like an ebb and flow sometimes in terms of that, really, like all relationships. So again, like as a client, you as the writer, that's why you have to generate. You need to catch our attention. Like, we expect to read something every week. If you're not writing or generating something every week, we start to lose interest. Like, we start to feel that you're not invested in your career, so why should we? So but we can get into the nuances of that in another panel discussion, I think.
Panel number 2, yeah. So thank you all for those great answers. Let's start going through some of the questions that were submitted here. Again, some we've probably touched on a bit. This one I want to ask about is in terms of competition placement. Ryan was asking, gets the sense that competition placement is heavily sort of dictated by current market trends and wants and needs. Do you think there's any truth to that? And if so, can a writer essentially use that as a market testing tool to see if their script sort of is checking the boxes of what a lot of people are looking for?
This is a tough question because I personally don't think that the competition placement reflects market trends. I think that you can look at success stories as a way potentially to determine it, but market trends are reflected in the trades, if you're looking at what's been sold. So I think you can use a competition in tandem with the trends that are happening in real time through Deadline or the Hollywood Reporter to kind of test the theory. But because depending on the competition and depending on the judges, really the placement is like determining like the quality of the script, not necessarily the viability for the marketplace. So I think it's a very interesting perspective of what competitions can do and the asset, but more than anything, I think if you're submitting, you want to know how you rank against other scripts in the market or in the competition market. But I don't think you're using it. It's not a one-to-one about like, okay, this is something then that like Disney Plus is going to make.
No, absolutely, yeah. Because again, like it just depends on the makeup of who the judges are, depending on the round, semifinalists, finalists, winners, whatever. They may be representatives from different companies who have their own mandates who will conflict. Like they have different mandates, so the needs are not exactly aligned. But what is consistent across the board is that they have to follow a rubric. They have to follow a scoring rubric based off of like concept, plot, structure, characters, dialogue. Maybe there might be a category for viability in the marketplace, but that's just one element along with writing style, voice, all of that. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily an indicator of marketplace, but competition marketplace probably.
Thank you. We were talking a little bit about, I see a couple of questions about sort of how to promote your placement. And I think we touched on that a little bit earlier. In your opinion, just real quick, are there certain platforms like social media platforms or anything that you think are a more effective tool and one that writers should focus more on trying to sort of promote their competition placements versus others?
I find that like the Twitter writing community is one that I'm like constantly like watching and lurking over. And LinkedIn is one that I don't often look at. I just find that just even the interface feels really impersonal, whereas Twitter, I find that like I really can get a sense of the writer's personality just from what they're kind of like the musings that they're putting out there. But I would also just say, like, in terms of boundaries, like people who randomly like request to be my friend on LinkedIn. I don't even think you request to be someone's friend. Make the connection on LinkedIn. Because I don't know that person, there's a little bit of like I don't know how far this is going to go, right? Like I'd rather just receive a query from my email rather than like a LinkedIn query. And then there are other boundaries of like sometimes someone will message me on Instagram and I just find that like that's not the medium through which I'm conducting my business. So just being mindful about the ways in which you're promoting yourself and also trying to contact industry professionals, that sometimes it can come off a little bit unprofessional if you decide to connect with them through specific social media platforms.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think if anything through social media, if you can get the competition administrators, they have their own social media accounts. If they can promote you or do like a blog interview success story type thing, when I was at AFF, I had writers always approach me because they wanted to be featured somehow, because I would always interview the writers who did well, but it's because they had something to show for it after, or they had an experience that could be useful. So if you have an experience that is useful and you could sort of generate it into a story that's not just like, hey, here I am, you're self-promoting yourself, hashtag, AFF finalist, whatever. I don't even know if that trends. If you can have something that's on social media that is actually of substance, that would work better.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna try to go like little lightning speed through some of these to try to get as many as possible. So if someone submits a writing sample, they feel it's a little bit rushed, are they forever done for with a specific contest? Or like, is there a scarlet letter that says like, no, you can never, this writer is excommunicado, a la John Wick?
I say no, but what I do remember are the entrants with really bad behavior and cannot handle rejection. I remember them just as much as the really great ones. I've had people call me angry because they got declined for whatever reason. They took it really personal. So that's what I remember more. Like it kind of goes back to what I said before, that, we forget, like you get new readers every year. We want to see improvement. We encourage you to keep submitting. But, think first before you spend the money for the entry fee in a competition. Yeah. If it's ready. Don't just rush to see if someone's going to be able to sift through the mess of your first draft and be able to see the potential. It's a writing competition. They're judging it off the quality of the writing, so don't submit.
Well said. Well said. Thank you. Let's see here. This goes back to preach it, Matt. Vaughn's into it. Okay, we kind of touched on that one. Yeah, the filtering process. Jack's had a question here. The reader filtering process, and readers don't recognize their own bias. Good scripts by underrepresented writers get marked down. I know, being a competition administrator, I have my thoughts on that, but I'm curious, Matt or Daniela, do you have any sort of perspectives or comments on that?
I really think that given the roles that we play and the relationships we have with the script, like the administrators and the people who are handling the competition, there are some scripts that don't get placed, or some scripts that might be overlooked because they'll see the feedback, or they'll see, and it's just there's a mathematic and they're like the formula of how the scripts are graded, but sometimes the administrators are like, this script was really good, or like the voice is really raw, like the story needs a little bit of finessing, but I'm really sparked by this perspective. And so I can see how it can be hard to trust a process where like there are people operating in the shadows, but more so as a judge, I think the inclination and the excitement is to be a part of that process. And even if I'm just being given, 10 scripts by a contest to evaluate the best of those 10, I still want to look at the log lines for the other ones that may not have made it that far, just in case there's one that speaks more to what I'm looking for. So hopefully that answers Jax's question and concern. I can understand the concern. Hollywood is not meant to be mysterious, but it gives off those vibes.
Yeah. I agree with all that.
Something I want to say also back to Matt's last comment regarding, a quick emotional reaction to something is sort of a mantra philosophy that I learned from somebody years ago that I always live by is like, never make a permanent decision based on a temporary emotion, right? Sometimes you might see something, you have a quick emotional reaction to it, and an instinct might be to just jump at something and or say something, but then you actually haven't taken the time or taken a moment to actually think, let those initial sort of feelings subside and make sure, say, okay, am I actually coming at this from a level-headed perspective? Am I really thinking about that? All right, at 6 o'clock, I want to get like one more, let's see, what do we got?
I've also tried my best to answer as many, but it's hard to type and talk and listen at the same time. But Karen had asked a question that was specific to Matt that was called, what do you mean by winks for the reader? And it was something that caught my attention because when you think about as a writer and someone is reading the medium, even though it's made for film or for TV, that there was one wink that I really appreciated where I was reading a con artist story and there was a montage and the writer wrote, and now time for a contage. And it was so playful. It was like a wink and a nod of like, this is the genre you're reading. And it was super exciting. So that can be really playful. And it just makes you enjoy the read a little bit more, that like the person is like cognizant that like the first step to getting anything made is the read. And if you can enjoy the read, then you want to talk to the writer. So that's just kind of an aspect.
Yeah, Shane Black, exactly. That's exactly who I was thinking of. There was also like a nickel winning script that opened up with "fade in, bitches." Like, you don't want to copy that, but I mean, like immediately, like, okay, this could either go way down south, or I could be in for a fun wild ride, and it was more that.
Love it. Okay, we are at our time. I want to thank you both so much for sharing your perspective and your insights. I'm excited to be working with both of you as judges this year, and Matt in particular, and in Lit Entertainment Group, who's doing the guaranteed signing prize for our JumpStart competition this year. I'm super excited. So thank you. We tried with a lot of the questions. I'm sorry if yours didn't get answered this time, but we really appreciate it. And by the way, once you get this recording, this information that you learned, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a friend, with the writing community too, so that they can learn the insights that you did too. So thank you again so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you for having us. Sorry we couldn't answer all of your questions, but the beauty is the internet has plenty of resources. I feel like Matt and I have like together and separately spoken on several of these topics, especially about securing representation, the query process. So like, go seek out those resources. And thank you, Jorge, for having us.
Yeah, and good luck to you all, and absorb everything that we said and really think before you query us, please. We know it's coming. And we're
bracing
ourselves. It's just a matter of the timing.
Yeah.
I like George said, fade out, bitches.
On that note.
On that note, thank you again, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.